Hey, Eric, welcome to the Booked on Rock podcast. This is Eric. How are you, Eric?
Thank you, Eric.
Let's get into the book. The Monkees. Actually, this is not the first book you've written on the Monkees, correct? There's one back in 1985, which was a bestseller. Tell us about that one and your history with the band.
Okay, well, I started that book in 1984, and pretty much was inspired at the time by the punk movement because the Sex Pistols had done a cover of I'm Not Your Stepping Stone. And I went to a store and saw the Monkees' greatest hits, and I saw Stepping Stone on that. And then I put two and two together and thought, these guys are still strangely kind of relevant. Now, why is that? So that tickled my imagination, and I ended up writing a series of articles about the Monkees at that point. Found a publisher and interviewed those four guys. And at the time, the phenomenon was, in a way, like completely moribund. Nobody was talking about the Monkees. So it kind of caught a little fire when MTV put the Monkees back on the air. And suddenly there was a whole new generation of fans coming along. And I was lucky enough, or, fortunate enough to have a book out at that time. So that's the general sketch of it. But yeah.
Well, we know the power of MTV as far as what it did for bands. Talk about what that did for your book. Was it a really, really huge increase in sales after that?
Well, yes. But it took a little finagling on my part because I was with a very indie publisher at the time who didn't have that wide a distribution. So what I did is I went into actually a punk rock studio where they were making Black Flag videos, etc. I was on the West Coast, and I made a commercial. Remember those old 1-800 ads? You dial up and order something like the Ronco chopper or whatever. I made a kind of satirical ad about the Monkees' Tale. That was the name of the book. Hey, we're the Monkees, and made a sort of phony salesman voice. And then every time I said the Monkees, since I couldn't use the copyright image, I would pop the four monkey puppets up on the commercial with screaming in the background. So it was really a garage rock commercial. But MTV started running it 3 or 4 times, 5 times a day, and that really helped. That was a direct way for people who were interested to get the book, and it took off from there.
And did you have difficulty keeping up with stock? Did you have to keep?
Well, it was it was a hot thing. It kind of made the top 10 for a second there, for a hot second, which was exciting because I was a young guy. So, I didn't even dream that this could happen, that I'd find a wide audience for it. And funny things started to happen. Once there's a commodity that is hot for a few months, books started falling off the truck, in quotes, and strange things started happening like that. But it also created a lot of strange pressure because I had co-opted the Monkees logo on the cover of the book, Monkees' Tale. And then I understood I was going to be sued because I'd used this logo without permission. So there was all sorts of madness going on. It was an exciting time. I was a young guy. MTV was showing, Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston videos. So it was like one of these classic eras. And then there was the Monkees, and they really promoted the heck out of it. They, if you remember back in those days, MTV was just a behemoth of promotion.
It was, yeah. That was 1985's The Monkees' Tale. And now we're going to talk about Monkee Business, the revolutionary made-for-TV band, originally published in 2013, but you've got a new edition, which we're going to talk about when it's released, where people can get it, and kind of preview a little bit of what's in that new edition. So let's go back to the beginning, the formation of the band. And there's a story in your book about the about-to-be-famous Monkees, all being at the Beatles concert at Dodger Stadium, August 28th, 1966. Last Train to Clarksville was already a huge hit on the radio, but the TV show hadn't aired yet. Who conceived the idea at first, and how does this all come together? This goes back to even before the Beatles formed, which I had no idea that this was the case.
That was with Bob Rafelson, the truly the creative genius behind it, said. He said that he had an idea about a traveling itinerant folk band, which I guess he had been part of prior to the Beatles, becoming a TV show. And he thought that like the hijinks of four people traveling around being a band was of interest to him. And that's a story he liked to tell. Bob Rafelson told a lot of tall tales. So his co-creator, Bert Schneider, was more direct and said, we really had the idea after seeing A Hard Day's Night, which kind of makes sense, because obviously the Monkees was a derivative of that kind of movie. What happened was that Bert Schneider, his father worked for Columbia Pictures and was actually the president of Columbia Pictures. And Bob Rafelson had this idea. Together, they put together a pilot. They auditioned 437 applicants through an ad in Variety. Everybody who was anybody showed up in LA, and that included people like Harry Nilsson and let me see, Paul Williams, a whole list of people.
Bobby Pickett, right? Boris Pickett.
Boris Pickett, yeah. Which I found funny because he had already the Monster Mash guy was looking for another hit, and then Stephen Stills, who was an incipient rock star at the time, and he apparently didn't quite have the look, and he threw the pass to Peter Tork, and Peter Tork became a Monkee, which is an interesting development because Peter Tork was really a street character, and they needed a street character, someone truly authentic who was not from the pop world, and I think he filled that role well. Davy Jones was already signed to Columbia Pictures, so they were looking for a vehicle for him. He had been a Tony-nominated star of Oliver on Broadway, and an interesting sidelight, it was that he was there the first time the Beatles performed on Ed Sullivan as a cast member of Oliver. So he was right on the scene. And then Micky, who had been a kid star on a show called Circus Boy, had a very winning personality and had been on TV before, so and had a great voice. So he got the job. And the other real shot in the dark was Michael Nesmith, who did see this ad in Variety and showed up wearing a wool cap and had his laundry slung over his shoulder like he just walked in from the street. And that's basically how the four guys came to be the Monkees.
Yeah, and I thought it was cool. The Beatles were fans of the Monkees. The Monkees were outselling the Beatles at one point, but they didn't mind. They were fans of the band.
Yeah, I think because of when the Monkees came along, they fulfilled sort of a gap. I call it the mania gap that existed when the Beatles started becoming more sophisticated and started writing songs, that we heard on Revolver or Rubber Soul. They were leaving behind that teeny bopper audience, and no other team band had a mystique quite like the Monkees created. So with that creative team of Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider and an incredible crew of songwriters like Carole King, Neil Diamond, Harry Nilsson later on, Neil Sedaka, real talented people. They had the edge over any other, let's say, natural band that would have come along, because this was a manufactured pop phenomenon, and they were advertised all over the country. They had a show on every Monday at 7:30 where they could promote their videos. So you had a lot of different corporate concerns coming together to promote this band. So the Beatles didn't mind that. I think they found the show entertaining, and they weren't threatened by it. And they actually expressed their affection for it, and then held a party for the Monkees. And there's all sorts of connections between those two entities, which you would not figure, because a lot of people who didn't know that, actually looked down on the Monkees because they thought they were so derivative of the Beatles. But the Beatles themselves, top dogs, loved them.
And a few of the names considered: the Creeps, the Inevitables, right? Those are the two other possible names?
Yes, they could have been the Creeps. I don't think that quite has the same sizzle as the Monkees.
Yeah.
And the Inevitables is interesting, because then there was the plastic exploding inevitable, the Velvet Underground. That was their catchphrase. So there was something inevitable about this idea, but never has it been done before or after in quite the same way. And we can get into that, but I think there some sort of magic happened where it crossed over from fantasy to reality that really tickled the imaginations of people that I guess they could see themselves in the Monkees somehow. You couldn't really see yourself being in the Beatles, but you could kind of see yourself being in the Monkees.
Yeah, a little more approachable, kind of like I think you said, the bumbling idiots making, always trying to do something, and they almost like a Three Stooges type of thing, which is I think why we love the Stooges so much.
Right, they never made it. No matter what, they would come close, but I think that was a real clever conceit of the show, is not to make them into rock stars, make them into wannabe rock stars. So we can relate to that. All of us who pick up a guitar and try to write songs. So that was part of the appeal, and also they used the real names of the actors on the show. So I think the public couldn't separate the identities of the characters that they were seeing on this TV show from the real people who wanted to actually form a real band. So at some point, there was this crossover between fantasy and reality, and I think they've always stayed in a kind of strange, in-between world between those two polar opposites.
There were a couple other names in the chapter regarding the auditions. I think did you mention, we mentioned Bobby Pickett, but did you mention there was another one? Danny Hutton, did you mention, a later of Three Dog Night? Did we just
yes,
get that one?
He did. Yes, he auditioned, and let me see. Well, I started an urban legend, which I shouldn't be proud of, but in a way, it's like at least I started one by saying that Charles Manson had tried out for the Monkees.
So you're the one.
Well,
I've read that in so many different articles.
That went around the world.
Let's get into that one. This is great.
I mean, okay, now that I didn't entirely start that. There's a fairly legendary DJ, Rodney Bingenheimer.
Yeah. He also auditioned, right?
He also
well,
auditioned.
I know of that name as a big Van Halen fan. He was part of the emergence of Van Halen because he played "You Really Got Me" on the radio before it was released.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, there's a cool story behind that. Yeah.
That makes sense, because Rodney is kind of like the Forrest Gump of rock and roll. Like he's literally everywhere. It's a little scary.
Yep.
But he was a double on the set of the Monkees as well for Davy Jones. So when I was interviewing Rodney back in, I guess this is 40 years ago, my goodness, he told me the rumor that Charles Manson had tried out for the Monkees. So I thought that was absurd. And in fact, in the original Monkey's Tale, I said reportedly Charles Manson took a stab at the job, which is a sick joke, but
yes,
there you go. I was cheeky myself back then. I was a young guy, and I was sort of playing it loose. But then when MTV interviewed me for a documentary, they brought that up, and they popped his face on the TV set with the wool cap of Mike Nesmith. And I think once people saw that urban legend just went all around, and I still hear it these days, and I have to smile to myself. That
it's pretty easily debunkable, if that's a word, because if you look at he was in jail at the time when the auditions were taking place. He got out of jail in San Francisco in like 67, 68, can't remember. But auditions were in 66 for the Monkees. What year was that?
Yeah, the ad went up in 65, so that would have been early 66. They would have had the auditions. I do believe it could have been late 65. And I think it was a little more believable at the time because Manson I had an interest in having a music career. So also, we didn't have the internet back then, so there was no way for people to run down facts like that so easily. To put it into that context, and I think that was had a lot to do with the success of my book, is that there weren't that many places to go, hardly anything existed. Maybe some liner notes to some records, but if someone wanted to know something about the Monkees, at best you could go to the library and look at some encyclopedias or look up the articles. So just to put it into context, this pre-internet era, stuff like my book, kind of got handed around from person to person.
That was the go-to.
I was proud of that. Yeah, at the time, I don't know if I appreciated it enough, like how hard it is to, get a book out there. I know you interview a lot of authors, and you could spend so many years on these things, and then on the day of the release, something else happens in the world, and you're overshadowed, and it takes time to for the public sometimes to connect to something, and this would have been that had MTV not put the Monkees back on the air.
Yeah, I always have great admiration for authors. I'm a short distance writer. I've said this before. I write articles. Writing a book it's a long distance run, and you have to have a lot of patience, right? You have to kind of pace yourself. Maybe go. I mean, at times you feel like you need to take a break from it and go back to it, or the reverse is you get so immersed in the book that you have to step away for a bit, because I can imagine it's an all-consuming project.
Yeah, I have a friend from back then, Gary Strobel. He's an authority on the Monkees, and great guy if he's listening. Gary is one of the ultimate collectors of Monkees information. And back then, when I was releasing my book, he was trying to finish up his book, and I believe he's still working on it 40 years later. So there's a great book coming out eventually by Gary Strobel, if it's not out already. And he had a day job. He had to do other things, but there were other people who were writing books at the same time as me, and I felt fortunate to be the first.
Yeah, going back to the Stephen Stills story, if he had maybe gone to the dentist, he might have gotten this gig. That was the problem
Yes.
He had like one tooth that was like,
yeah, so recessed tooth.
Yeah. What was his response to that, though? He seemed to handle that pretty well, right?
Right. Well, I guess within a year, he had a #1 song with "For What It's Worth." So he must have had a couple of, backup plans. But the other thing about Stephen Stills is that he would have had to take a publishing deal with Screen Gems. So all copyrights of the Monkee songs had to be a Screen Gem song. They really locked that down. So if you came from another publisher, you could literally not make a record with the Monkees. So Stephen Stills didn't want to give up his publishing, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, a lot of that stuff happens. Just reading a book on Prince, I don't think it was in the book, but it just makes me think of, I was listening to Prince music and the songs from Batman, and I believe Timothy, I'm also drawing a blank on the director of the Batman.
Burton, yeah.
Timothy Burton wanted a different artist, but that artist wasn't part of Warner Brothers. Prince was, so they get Prince. A lot of that stuff happens.
That's very interesting. Legal stuff. I think this really affected the Monkees, and I guess we'll probably get to the point where they want to become a real band. But the first song that they wanted to release as a real band, that's the 4 guys playing on a record versus having these great studio musicians, was a song called All of Your Toys, which was not a Screen Gems song, so it couldn't be released. So this did actually affect them. Eventually, that policy lightened up with a great song by Paul Williams called Someday Man. But that was much later in their career. Otherwise, it had to be under Screen Gems. It had to be, everything was like RCA, NBC, and Screen Gems. It was like kind of a preview in some ways of our current culture, where a bunch of big entities come together to promote something, like Marvel. and the studios.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's continue with the musical side of the Monkees now. So 3 songs written, I believe, before the band was formed, one of them being the theme from the Monkees, right? That was before they formed. They already had that song.
Yes, that was written for the pilot, and I think it's the key song in the whole discography.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me about, who wrote the song? How did the guys in the band respond? Because it seems as if they were given a false promise that eventually they could write and perform. Like, hey, don't worry, guys, but for now, let's just do it this way. But that was not a good sign of things to come.
Right, because everything was about power and control, because there was so much money involved in this thing that everybody wanted to wet their beak. And so Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart they were a songwriting duo that had already had some hits with Jay and the Americans and others. They were writing for Aldon, which was Don Kirshner's publishing company, which was the hottest publishing company of its time, the Brill Building people. And they were called in at the last second to come up with some songs for this pilot. So it was all very, slapdash and quick. And one thing that they were commissioned to do was come up with this theme song. And I think it's quite a brilliant song. You kind of have the whole controversy of the Monkees wrapped up in this song because it's super professional. It's like once heard, never forgotten song. So, I mean, I think even kids today, if they hear that song one time, here we come walking down the street, it's very ominous in a way, but then they defang the whole ominous part of it by saying, well, we're just too busy singing to put anybody down. So that was like a code to parents that this isn't going to be too controversial. So they were kind of playing it both sides of the fence. And I think that's why the Monkees kind of was a revolutionary concept for its time. It was allowing rock and roll into the living rooms of America where it had never been. There was no parental control figure for these guys. They didn't even have a manager. But at the same time, they were good guys. They weren't doing drugs and, just sleeping around. It was very chaste. And so in a way, I think the Monkees was a delivery system for a certain countercultural idea to get into the mainstream. And I think the theme song captures that because it's a little ominous, but it's also very ingratiating.
Who are the musicians that are playing on the track? Is
the Wrecking Crew?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the Wrecking Crew is on this. The Wrecking Crew were on the first 2 records. Last Train to Clarksville is also, I think, an amazing song because basically, it came out before the show and was a hit before the show. So I think we can surmise that the Monkees would have had hits even without the TV show because they had Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart writing, just a classic pop song. And, we've got Glenn Campbell on these tracks. We've got Hal Blaine. We've got Larry Knechtel. We've got, super talented people. And the surprisingly supple voice of Micky Dolenz. Like, who could have predicted? But this guy who's still out there singing today really had some pop chops.
Yeah, that's important to know, too. All of them are singing on these tracks.
Yes, okay. That they were relegated to vocals only. Mm-hmm. I don't know if the controversy could be understood by young people today. Like, why would it be controversial that they only sang on their tracks? That doesn't sound like a big deal these days. Right. But back then, there was a certain purism about music. I guess it came out of the folk movement, where you got your, very sincere singer on the microphone, singing a sincere song, and they created it. What you heard is what you got, and for some reason, people really took offense to the Monkees, even though the Beach Boys were making their records the same way, and Sonny and Cher and the Byrds and all sorts of West Coast bands. We're doing that.
The Beach Boys, the biggest example. Yeah.
That's the biggest example. Yes.
It was just Brian Wilson and the people that he would have in front of him to create the sound that he envisioned. Yeah, that's strange.
Right. And so for some reason, the Monkees became the whipping boys. And the reaction was severe. And they were really chastised and they felt really bad about it. And there was this sort of incipient rock press like Rolling Stone magazine, which needed something to hate. So they hated the Monkees. So when I tell people this story now, I think they scratch their heads because what was the controversy about? They had a TV show. There were actors in the TV show playing a band, a fictional band, and they were singing on these songs. But they don't get the fact that not being a real band, was controversial. But at the time, it was really controversial. That's why it was so important that people like the Beatles liked them. So, their own peers understood what was happening, but a lot of purists hammered them, and they took a lot of crap.
Yeah. They're just young guys, kids, really, right? Like 20, 21 years old. I mean, dealing with that must have been difficult for them.
And I think someone like a Davy Jones, who was a Broadway actor, would have been perfectly content to sing songs on the microphone and act like a guy in a band. But Michael Nesmith and Peter Tork were horrified that they were having to pretend to play the instruments on the TV show. So that was the rub right there, that they had to pretend that they were playing these instruments, and they were being ridiculed for that. And they just couldn't put up with it. So eventually that's the big moment in the story is when they rebel against basically the most successful publishing firm in the world at the time. So I don't know if this would happen today. I think people would like to have most of the world's great songwriters writing songs for them. In fact, I think that's how a lot of records are made now, by committee. But back then, these guys sacrificed millions of dollars and probably a longer career so they could go in and make their own music. I guess while we're on it, we might as well tell that story. That's Michael Nesmith.
Don Kirshner, right? He was in The Office.
Yeah, so Don Kirshner gets sort of painted as the bad guy in all of this because he was just thrilled. Like every record that he was putting out, like I'm a Believer, sold 10 million copies. The albums were number one, the singles were number one. And in fact, Michael Nesmith famously said about I'm a Believer, he goes, I'm a songwriter and I can tell you that's not a hit. Like I know, because I know, good songs. So obviously he didn't have a clue about writing a number one pop song, but he really wanted to get his own songs on these albums, which he had done to a certain extent, but he wanted to be a real rock band. It's like the old Pinocchio story, really. So Don Kirshner was trying to sort of keep them in line, and had a photo opportunity where he gave them these big giant checks for like $250,000. And there was a stage meeting, and then backstage, Nesmith demanded that he have control over his music or he quit. And one of the lawyers started waving a contract in his face. And I guess Nesmith lost control, punched a hole in the wall, and said, that could have been your face. And that's kind of the hinge in the story where everything goes sideways.
Was that the guy, Herb Molis?
Oh, yeah, Herb Molis.
Molis. He's the attorney who's waving, shaking the thing in front of him.
Right. And, I can see both sides of it, to be honest with you. They had a money minting enterprise, and why rock the boat? From their point of view, this guy was a punk, really, right? What's your problem? We just gave you $250,000. But Nesmith was really a very interesting figure. I think he's the one I found most interesting of all of them. They're all interesting guys. But Nesmith was kind of a guy out of left field, like a real intellectual futurist, and he could kind of see a couple of chess moves ahead. And I think we're still talking about them because of his ambitions. I think if they had just stayed a pop band, sure, they would have their place in, sunshine pop history. They had already been successful. But because they decided to make their own music and make a movie I think they started veering into actual like art, and offering things that you could not have anticipated when they first got together.
Yeah, the debut episode of the TV show, I want to go back to that as well. September 12, 1966, that's 7:30 p.m. Talk about the TV show. Some of the things that they were doing both visually and with the overall storylines that hadn't been done before.
Right, yeah, I think that's what made it so amiable. One of the techniques that they invented for the show, the director, was to take these interviews like you would have on a reality TV show now, where you take someone aside and interview them about what had just happened, that broke the fourth wall and asked the Monkees about their real lives, like on the side of the set, just sitting in the chairs, relaxing afterwards. This was the key to audience identification with them. Like, okay, wait a minute, they're real people. They're not just playing these roles. And then the show itself was just frantic. I remember because, admittedly, I was on this planet then, so I was right in their audience. I was 6 years old when they debuted. And I remember seeing it, and I just couldn't believe how much action there was. It was really fast cuts, like freeze frames, absurd humor, slapstick, and it kind of flew by fast. And I think all the visual techniques that we see in videos now were there at that time, but they were so far ahead of their time that it was bedazzling. It was kind of bedazzling, like you couldn't really catch it. It was going by so fast. And that had, I think that had a big effect on the industry too. I don't think anything had ever been made quite that way before. And if anything, it was borrowing techniques from European art films and stuff. So, it was way over the heads of kids like me.
Did the ratings do well right away, or was it a slow build?
It was always a slow build. They kind of actually created lower ratings by acting out at a corporate event where some stations were so appalled by the Monkees' personal behavior, just goofing around, that some markets didn't air the show. So that always affected the ratings. However, it did well enough to stay on for 2 years, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the way those episodes are packed with so much, there's 2 videos per episode. I guess that was about the natural length that we could have expected the show to stay on the air. But it was never like a top 10 show.
Okay. How many episodes in all total?
I think it was 52 overall. So most shows have to, I believe, have like 100 episodes to go into syndication. But they managed to do that with 52 episodes. So, I think you couldn't go much farther with the concept than they had gone. How many different ways can you tell the story? And some of them got pretty druggy and weird in the second season. So the show really took a turn and got sort of more abstract after a while. And I'm not sure they could have taken it any farther than that. That's why they made the movie.
Right. Yeah, the Munsters didn't. I don't think the Munsters had 100 episodes, did they? Because that was a short.
Don't know.
Yeah, 2 seasons for the Munsters, 70 episodes. Same thing, though. Became a huge show in syndication.
Right. I guess if you pack enough into those 2 years and the formula is pleasing, it's like a great pop song. You can hear a great pop song 500 times, you still love it. And I think that this is similar to that, where they didn't have to make 150 of them for it to be iconic.
Yeah. Now the lack of interviews was a specific plan because they didn't want the guys to talk about the music, who played the instruments, but that kind of backfired on them.
Absolutely, yeah, that
Yeah.
backfired 100% because these guys, they were typical young men from the mid '60s, and there was all this ferment, with the Vietnam War and civil rights, and they weren't allowed to comment on it until finally they allowed some reporters access. And as soon as the guys could talk out about the war, they were just right on it. And so at the time, that would have been massively controversial to have these mainstream TV stars speaking out against the Vietnam War. That just wasn't being done. So they tried to hold that off as long as possible. Ironically, one of the producers, Bert Schneider, who finally gave them permission to become a real band, ended up producing an Oscar-winning documentary about the Vietnam War only, 5 or 6 years later. So it wasn't like politically they were misaligned with these guys. They weren't coming from that angle, but they were just trying to protect this product as long as they could.
Well, and then there was that one interview with Michael Nesmith, January of '67, with the Saturday Evening Post. That is a big deal. To talk about what he says in there and how that would impact the band.
Yes, this interview, I think, created a rift that never quite healed in the band. So Nesmith, who was given to sort of, let's just say, he used a lot of big words. That was his his way of communicating. He liked to sort of download the contents of whatever was on his mind in a sort of a grandiose way. So this interviewer got a hold of him. He was so frustrated about the recording process that he said, "Tell the world we're synthetic, but damn it, that TV show is a real reflection of who we are." And that was the shot heard around the world. Like as soon as people read that one of the Monkees said that they were a fake band, well, that was it for 20 years. Like they had no shot at credibility. So the other members of the band weren't so thrilled that Nesmith was so critical. It was one thing to say, like this is how the records are put together, but it was another thing to say, I hate these records. And Nesmith crossed that line. I think he could have been a bit more subtle about it because in his dotage, he was out on the road up to the end of his life, still playing those songs. So, obviously he came around to them, but he had a chip on his shoulder.
Was he was the one that didn't really hang out with the other three guys? There was one particular,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
They'd
that's
throw a
what's said
party
about.
and they'd invite him over, and sometimes he wouldn't even show up at all.
Yeah, I think that he's a psychologically quite a complex guy. Personally, I found him really fascinating, and I was lucky enough to know him as an acquaintance, and I think he was just a confused young man looking back on it all, because he was really actually a very gracious person, but at the time he was a hothead, and I think that he was deeply affected by the idea that he was getting rich on something that was quote unquote uncool. And back then, being uncool was really, for some reason, a bigger deal. Now you could almost be uncool and make that your brand. But back then, people really cared about this movement, this rock and roll movement, and the Monkees seemed to be, the most plastic version of fake version of authentic culture. The weird thing is, after now 50, 60 years, the Monkees have now become an icon of that era. And I think they're, one of the bands that's representative of that era. But at the time, they couldn't have known that was going to happen.
Eric Lefcowitz is the author of Monkee Business, the revolutionary made-for-TV band, originally published in 2013, and he's here to tell us about the updated version, which we will get to. We did talk about that showdown with Kirshner. There was a meltdown in Cleveland prior to that. That would lead to the four members getting into the studio to prove what they could do on their own. Something happened there, I think.
Yes, they after the first record came out, they were appalled that they weren't given any credit really for the music. Even though Mike Nesmith had a couple of really great songs on the first record, um, Papa Jean's Blues being a great example, with just a really great pop song. Uh, they wanted to have some control over the second record. Well, it turns out Kirshner, sorry, had no interest in giving them any control. So he put together the second record, More of the Monkees, which is one of the best-selling pop records of all time now. But the Monkees wanted to have some say over what went on that record. They didn't even know it had come out, and they were in Cleveland playing a show.
They flipped it around to the backside, right? They saw the credits.
Right. And so someone brought them a copy, and they're playing, and they're all sitting there just steaming. And then they notice that they're not even credited. They're barely credited on their records. So Don Kirshner's going through and thanking all the songwriters and all the players. Oh, and by the way, the Monkees also, now we should say thanks to them. So that blew their minds. And then, of course, it went out and sold, millions and millions of copies. So that must have been a frustrating situation where you're also, like, the cover was an ad they had done for J.C. Penney, where they were trying to dress up in like polyester shirts, looking like they wouldn't have dressed that way in real life. But there it is on the cover of the record, and they were just appalled.
Yeah, I'm looking at the cover here. Yeah. But now I know the Jimi Hendrix story makes more sense. Now, knowing that information, why Micky was the one who wanted Hendrix to open for the Monkees, because it's a story that's often told and seen as an odd pairing. Like, what the hell were they thinking? But really, I think Micky was thinking, hey, this is going to legitimize the band here. This guy's the real deal. Let's have him tour with us. That's going to help us as well as it's going to help him. Didn't work out that way. But how did it all come together? And could you talk about how those shows went? Because Jimmy wasn't exactly a fan of the Monkees, nor their fans. Lasted 7 shows.
I don't think he was a fan. I think he liked the people in it. But you're making a real good point, Eric, is that really everything after that fight with Kirshner can be seen through the lens of the Monkees trying to gain credibility. And they're never going to get it. We know that now. I mean, they're not going to get it in the original incarnation, but they don't know that. So they're really desperately trying to be seen as, credible artists. And like, no one had a shot. The Monkees had no shot at being seen as, contenders to the crown of authenticity. So when Micky was at the Monterey Pop Festival, and you saw Hendrix, and there's footage of Micky at that in the film, the Pennebaker film, Monterey Pop, and he looks blazed, and I think everybody was, but you kind of see him looking like he's tripping out. So I think he saw Hendrix and had a big idea, like, this is the guy who's got to open for us on the next tour. And as absurd as that sounds to the Hendrix management, that was not a bad deal, because they were going to get all sorts of publicity from that. And people forget that Jimi Hendrix was a virtual unknown. That film didn't come out for a while. So, that made a huge difference in his career, because there was all these articles written in the press about this mismatch between the Monkees and Hendrix. And reportedly, Hendrix flipped the bird to the fans because they were all yelling for Davy. I think it's one of the great mismatches ever, but it sure is a lot of fun to think about.
It's a wild story.
Could you imagine, like, being a young kid and going to see the Monkees, and then this guy comes out and starts singing Purple Haze? Like, it had to blow a lot of minds.
Yes. Yeah, it's that's worthy of a documentary.
I think there is one. If you look it up on YouTube, there's like a mini documentary that came out about 6 months ago. uh, called something along the lines of From the Monkees to the Hollywood Bowl, and it covers that part of Hendrix's history in pretty close detail. And there's great photos of Hendrix having a great time backstage, and it's a legendary thing. I mean, I would say it's one of the great legends of rock and roll that the Monkees, closed the show for Jimi Hendrix.
There was a story you tell in the book where Mickey is hanging out with Jimmy and was it one of the Beatles?
Steve Stills.
Oh, Stephen Stills. And Mickey was walking out of the room and like, hey, where you go, man? Come on. Keep jamming.
Yeah, they were having a jam session.
He didn't think he was welcome. I don't know. What was that about?
I think he just thought no one was listening to him.
Yeah,
so he was kind of like, slapping some drums and playing along, and he stopped and everyone looked and said, what's up?
Come on, man.
I don't know. I didn't think you were listening,
Yeah.
but he also was supposed to audition for Frank Zappa's band after the Monkees. So he didn't have a lot of faith in his drumming. I think that's fair to say that, compared to studio pros like Jim Gordon and, Jim Keltner and Hal Blaine, Micky Dolenz was a rank amateur. So, I guess he just didn't have any confidence about it.
Yeah, well, he had to learn how to play the drums from scratch when he got hired for the show, didn't he? Or did he play drums?
Yeah. It shows, on the early recordings, you can tell that, he's having some trouble with tempos, and, he's an amateur drummer all the way. He should have been the lead guy, in my opinion. I think that a lot of people came to that conclusion. I mean, Davy was the heartthrob, but, Mickey was sort of hidden behind the drums. It's the same thing that happened to the Carpenters. Like Karen Carpenter was, actually an excellent drummer, and they made her come out because you need a front person. Well, Mickey, it went in reverse. So, he was the lead singer of the band, and he ended up on the drums. And, it's not that persuasive when you watch the videos. You can see that he's trying to sing and mime the drums at the same time. And, in the end, he did a few tracks that were actually fairly impressive. But I think this would be a struggle for anybody to suddenly be on stage in front of, 17,000 people having to drum,
you think?
and sing at the same time.
Yeah.
So
he soldiered through it.
Mickey is a pro. Mickey is a pro's pro. And, I do really admire him for that.
The band proved themselves with 67's Headquarters. So that's the third album. They have complete control over what's on that album. It goes to number 1 in the US, double platinum, number 2 in the UK. So they had to have been so happy about that. And the fame and the fortune continues. And I want to read what you lead chapter 33 with. You write, quote, "The private lives of the four Monkees, when there was time for privacy, were filled with all sorts of intrigue, details of which rarely reached the public. Had some of the more salacious information been disclosed, the group's good standing and public image would have been in trouble." What are some of the stories you could share that are in the book about the four members? Because Peter Tork had a place at Laurel Canyon that was quite the party pad.
That's true. Yeah. Tork had what I describe as a Caligula-like scene where basically everything and anything went. And Peter was famous for walking around naked and swimming naked. And I guess he encouraged everyone to get naked. I think Davy said, he was turned off by that and used to run out. It was sort of scary. But, for what it was kind of a freak scene. And I think everything you can imagine, like orgies and, all sorts of drugs being done, everything you can imagine was probably being done. I think that it's not an exaggeration. A lot of like itinerant musicians at the time would stop by and stay there, like Jackson Browne and others would live on Peter's dime. Peter was kind of giving it away, kind of that he had this guilty conscience that he was becoming, so rich on this concept. All these things need to be placed in some sort of relevance, because I think it would be hard to understand now why someone would feel so bad for, being a number one pop star. But Peter in particular really invested his heart and soul into that record, Headquarters, which I think stands up as a do-it-yourself record. I think it's a fascinating record. And that and the following one, Pisces Aquarius, I think are like, some of the best pop records from that era. Headquarters to me is like the key record, because there they are playing their own instruments. 6 months before that, they had just been cast in a TV show, playing a band, and now they're actually a band, and successfully making cohesive pop music. And I've always found that record to be fascinating. If any of your listeners haven't heard it, I would say within that context, listen to Headquarters and see what you think.
You're right. And I'm just looking here. If I do the math correctly, it's 57 years ago this month it was released, May 22nd, 1967.
Oh my God, I feel old.
I know. You do the math and then you think, I was born, oh boy, wow. Yes, yeah, May 22nd, 1967. So how does that initial run end? How does that all play out? Peter quit first?
Peter quit after the movie Head, because Head bombed. Now this is, again, like, this become a cult classic, like a lot of stuff that they did post Kirshner, when they kind of became freaks. They started off as bubblegum and innocent fellas on the TV show, and by the end, they were kind of much edgier. The movie Head in particular is edgy, and Peter was so depressed by the failure of the movie that I think he regretted this, but he quit the band. I think he probably should have stuck around for a little bit longer, because the music was getting really interesting at that point. Especially his songs in Head are excellent songs, played by members of the Buffalo Springfield. So
Jack
pretty cool.
Nicholson produced that movie.
Yes, he did. He co-wrote it and produced it, and
produced by him, yeah. And Bob.
Yeah,
Rafelson?
I think. Yeah, Bob Rafelson directed it. Later, directed 5 Easy Pieces. The money from the Monkees, made Easy Rider. I mean, it's funny, like. At the time, I think nobody wanted to see this movie, because they made a really dark satire about themselves. That was the polar opposite of the TV show. And there was really no way the audience for the Monkees was going to go see this movie. And there was no way that the hip audience that was going to go see Easy Rider and all these, counterculture films that were about to come out were going to see Head. So it just made no money, but I think it was way ahead of its time. I think it was one of the earliest of the counterculture movies that hold up today. Much better. It holds up much better than most of the films from its time. But it's, a lot of people don't get it because it's nonlinear, but I think it's well worth a watch.
Zappa's in it. He plays the critic.
Yes, Zappa's really funny in it. Yeah, he's after a scene where Davy sings this song and dance number by Harry Nilsson called Daddy's Song. He's wandering out of the studio, and Zappa says, "Your music's pretty white." And then Davy says, "Well, so am I." And then Zappa says something along the lines of, the children of America are counting on you. It's just pretty funny scene. There's a lot of strange characters in that film. Sonny Liston, the boxer.
Sonny Liston, I've seen here, yeah.
Yeah, he was not a well-liked person, and and
Terry Garr.
Terry Garr is
Testy True. She's Testy True.
Yeah, she's very cute in the movie. In a scene that was later stolen by Mel Brooks in Blazing Saddles, where you break through the scenery. At the end of Blazing Saddles, there's the exact same kind of comic gag where someone bursts through the scenery and you can see the studio in the background.
How about Tony Basil of "Oh, Mickey, you're so fine, you blow my mind" fame?
yeah, she's
Daddy's song dancer.
Yeah, she's great.
Dennis Hopper.
Dennis Hopper makes an appearance in his Easy Rider uniform. So
Annette Funicello,
the Mouseketeer.
Yeah.
And then there's this crazy character actor, is one of my favorite parts of it, named Timothy Carey, who was in Kubrick films. He is just a scream in this movie. He acts as their manager. He has a cape, and he has some wild scenes. And he's a cult actor who was on the cover of Sergeant Pepper, believe it or not, but it's for some reason like he was on the original shoot, but they didn't use his photo. But
Let me
he was a
test your trivia.
well-known.
What was his character's
Yeah.
name? What was Timothy Carey's character's name? Do you remember?
Okay. What was his name?
I'm cheating. I'm looking at it, so it's not like
Oh,
I'm
yeah. What was his name? Mr.
Lord High and Low.
Lord High and Low.
Lord
He's
High and Low.
he's got some real funny scenes because he's just desperate to keep them in his fold and make money off of them. And I love Timothy Carey. I think he's one of the highlights of that film.
What a trip. What a trip. Prior to the Big Monkees resurgence in the mid 80s that you had talked about, which is thanks to your book and MTV running the TV show, there were reunions and revivals during the 70s. There was the Saturday morning syndication. Can you talk about those and who was part of them? The 70s was also a rough time for Peter Tork.
Yeah, poor Peter, like he got busted for just a little, having a little bit of hashish on him. And he went to prison for 3 months in Texas. And he really washed out. He had problems with alcohol. I think they all had problems getting jobs after the Monkees. They were typecast. And the strange thing is the records kept selling. Like the kids that grew up with the Monkees never, lost their love for them. But the show was off the air, even though, yes, it did show up in syndication. And then there was a potential reunion with the songwriters, Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart, with Davy and Micky. They toured. That didn't have any traction. So the 70s were a sort of a washout period for them. And, that's the era of corporate rock sort of coming along. And, they were from another era. But then when new wave music came along in the late 70s, early 80s, all of a sudden that idea of popcraft and, like creating characters sort of, making sense to people. And then the Monkees didn't seem so controversial. So a lot of bands from that time, like Blondie and the Ramones and Elvis Costello and later REM especially, they were major fans. They had grown up with this music and they loved them. And they were the kings of cool for their time. So all of a sudden, the landscape changed. And then MTV came along and in one fell swoop, they showed 22 straight hours of Monkees episodes out of the blue. Like no one saw that coming. And for people who had never even heard of the Monkees, they thought they, were a new band. Like there's.
And tell me about Michael Nesmith playing a role in the evolution of music video and MTV. This I had no idea about.
Yes, that's what you're picking up on, Eric, is that all roads sort of lead to this band. When you talk about Jimi Hendrix, you talk about the Beatles, you talk about MTV. There's so many Easy Rider, counterculture movies. It's kind of crazy. That's the thing that's hard to sum up. It's easy to sum up that this was a prefabricated band that was on television and had some hits, and that's it. But when you start talking about these other aspects of it, like Michael Nesmith made a video in the 70s for a song called Rio. And it got a really great reaction, and he kind of a light bulb went on in his head, and he thought, well, what about programming a whole show around videos? This hadn't been done. And he created the idea of VJs, and he sold the concept to Warner Brothers, who ended up taking it and creating MTV. So he was the father of MTV. And he was also one of the first country rock artists as well. So, he really was a visionary in some ways, but he never really got credit for any of that stuff because, as he predicted, the first line in his obituary was Monkee, Monkee Michael Nesmith. So,
well, yeah, and it's indicated by what I just said. I never even knew that. I had no idea until I read the book.
Yeah, well, he does have a good autobiography out, or he wrote it for obviously before he passed, called Infinite Tuesday, which is really reflects his personality. A real curious fellow, but definitely he had a vision. And of course, his mother invented whiteout, so he also had a few bucks in his pocket.
Yes, holy cow! Wow.
Yeah. So that One fun thing about the Monkees is just how many different, different ideas ends up, connecting to this band, from reality TV to psychedelia to, sunshine pop to all sorts of stuff. It's kind of a constant source of fascination. I guess that's why they're probably as big today in some ways, at least with fans of pop music, as they've ever been.
The second wave of Monkey Mania ran out of gas by like 87 or so, but the legacy of the Monkees, it seemed complete as you write to lead off chapter 62. And then the tours, because the tours would go on and on and on. So the legacy of the band, I think, starts to develop as we get into the 90s. How do they continue through that decade, though, and into the 2000s? Who's part of it? Who isn't? Who have we sadly lost? Because there was quite a few. I think they went in and out of reunions, tours, projects, right?
Yes, there was different configurations of the group. There was, Peter and Davy did a tour. Micky and Davy did a tour. The three of them did a tour. And the truth is, they didn't always get along, these guys. So unfortunately, there was a lot of backstabbing behind the scenes. But what did start happening is that the songs started showing up in movies, and generation after generation would discover the Monkees. For example, Shrek used "I'm a Believer," even though it wasn't the original version. And
Smash Mouth, right?
They did Smash Mouth did it, right? And then more recently, shows like Mad Men and WandaVision and Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. All these shows use Monkees songs, so people go back and they, younger people who don't know the Monkees go back and discover them. So there's something about that music that has become like one of the great song catalogs in pop history, and I think it does hold up because it's got all sorts of everything from garage rock to psychedelia. It's a fascinating. I think it's those songs which have made the Monkees so enduring.
And the last surviving member is Micky, right?
Yes, sadly, Micky is the only one left. Davy went first. That was a real shocker.
Yes, definitely right.
Poor Davy, was only in his mid-60s and had a heart attack. Peter was sick for a while and died of cancer in 2019, and Nesmith passed in 2021. So we're down to one Monkee, which is there's more Beatles left than Monkees, but we're happy that there's at least one Monkee is still around, and he's still out there doing it. And my feeling is that for such a packaged pop concept, that this thing has legs. And I think that even though their critics at the time would, never have believed it, I think that the idea behind the Monkees is a happy one. It's a good memory for people, and I do believe in the future people will still be interested in it and find their way to it if they're interested in pop music of the 1960s.
Yeah, I have a friend who's into all of the quote unquote legitimate artists in rock history, and the Monkees is on his list. He always gives me CDs, bootlegs of, here's a Clapton bootleg, and here's a great album by the Byrds. Here's and one day he said, here's the Monkees, and I love that they are part of his legitimate band list, and they really are. And they prove themselves with those albums. Starting with the third album, they proved that they could do it. This wasn't like a Milli Vanilli thing. These guys could do it.
Right. Yeah. No, they did do it. I think that,
and they did it well.
Did well. And they have the top studios and the top musicians. So that made a big difference.
So you sent me the extra chapters, part of the updated version of the book. So I want to finish with that. Picks up in 2012, and I want to focus specifically on the epilogue, which is so beautifully written, and it's very interesting, the observation that you make. So you write, quote, "The implications of overexposing your persona to the insatiable demands of a celebrity-obsessed culture are more familiar today. Dolenz, Jones, Nesmith, and Tork confronted these unforeseen dangers without a roadmap. Given the surrealistic twists and turns of their individual careers, it's quite amazing that all four of the Monkees survived with their sanity intact. Can you talk about how you say that the Monkees were ahead of their time in terms of being prefabricated band, video pioneers, and reality TV stars?
Well, I think the Monkees, in a way, their experience in the phenomenon at the time really sort of predates what people now experience in social media, where all of a sudden you go from a nobody or someone no one's ever heard of to, you go viral. So the Monkees were kind of an original viral concept where one week no one had ever heard of the Monkees. The next week they were like a top TV show. And so I think that was, presage our own era where you sort of sacrifice your privacy to go big. And I think the Monkees were an early example of that, where maybe inadvertently they wouldn't have known at the time that all the things that they were doing were going to become urban legends, like we've been discussing in this conversation. So I think they left a permanent trail like we leave today with social media posts. And in a way, you could see them as avatars, of the future, where you want to have your art, be commercial. You want to get out there and have your songs be hits. But what are you going to do what are you going to sacrifice along the way to achieve those goals? And I think the Monkees, they really went through sort of a kaleidoscopic journey that people experience these days too. You could just be out there in public and do something, accidentally trip over something. Someone might make a video of you, put it on TikTok, and now everybody knows who you are. Those pitfalls of fame were experienced by the Monkees almost 60 years ago, I guess now.
Yeah, Monkee Business, the revolutionary made-for-TV band. This is the title of the book. Tell us about the updated version. When and where can we get a copy of the new edition?
Well, the book just came out, and I'm also really proud of this audio book that was made of it. It's actually available to stream on Spotify, or else you can get it on Audible. It addresses the last 20 years of their career. They did make a great record in 2016 with Adam Schlesinger of Fountains of Wayne. I think it's worth a listen. I think Good Times is one of their top records. And it just addresses what happened to these guys. I followed their life from, beginning to end. And thank goodness Micky's still around. But a lot of people don't know the stories, the behind the scenes stories of what was going on in those last 20 years. And I try to cover it, warts and all. Not all of it's pretty, to be honest with you. It's tough to be an aging pop star. And the last tour with Michael Nesmith in particular, which I write about in great detail, which I witnessed, was very difficult to see. And he was in the last, weeks of his life. He insisted on doing this tour. He was in terrible shape, and it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking to watch, but in a way, I don't know. Like, do we want to go out on stage? A lot of people say they want to go out on stage. Like they want to die on stage. Well, he practically did that.
Yeah. So people can get it wherever you get books, Amazon.
Yeah. I think Amazon's, unfortunately, is the place that most books are sold these days. So it's up there. You can get the Kindle version. And also, if you want to just listen to that audiobook and you have a streaming service, you can access it that way. I do think it's a fairly legendary story, and that anyone who hasn't, who's a fan of music, pop music or rock and roll, who hasn't delved into the Monkee story will discover that it's fairly fascinating.
I'm going to check it out. I have Spotify, so I'll check out the audio version. That's cool. I didn't know that.
Well, thank you, Eric, because I listen to your show, and I really relate to all the authors out there who might be listening, who, follow their dream. And the Monkees. It's like I'm like Al Pacino in Godfather 3. They keep sucking me back in. Like I can't believe I'm still talking about them after 40 years. I hopefully answered all your questions today, but I got to say, there's something truly fascinating about these guys that I'm still gonna write another version of it one day and keep it going.
Well, actually, you know what? Before I forget, is there a movie planned? I mean, we're now these days there's movies for all of these legendary artists and bands. Is there something
Uh,
in the works?
there's some rumors about a big documentary, which I hope to see. But the inside word on that is they've always stopped any project from going to Broadway, like let's say like a jukebox musical, that type of thing.
Or like a
That
biopic, like the Bob Marley one, Elton John.
Yeah, I was actually approached by some producers,
I'm not
but
surprised.
and then what happened was that because the song catalog is so strong, it's like it seems like a no-brainer, but insiders who own this put the kibosh on it. So far there's a kibosh on it. So it might not happen in the near term, but maybe in the long term. It is a
Always.
natural, right?
Yeah, but there are always those legal hurdles to get over. Well, Eric, thank you so much for doing this. This is I agree. The Monkee story is fascinating, and at the end of the day, the music. It's about the music. Go out and listen to those songs. It's everywhere nowadays with streaming services, so give them a listen. I personally have to listen to that 2016 album. I have never listened to it, so I'm looking forward to it. It's all the 4 originals, right, on that album.
Right. They brought back some
Other
Davy
musicians.
vocals. And there's a song called Me and Magdalena, which has become one of their biggest streaming hits, which was a song written by Ben Gibbard of Death Cab for Cutie. And that's a real classic, like a late classic. It's a very adult song. And if you haven't heard that one, I find it very moving.
Yeah, that one I did listen to, and I didn't know that was on that album, but I just was hitting random while I was reading your book, and that was one that came up, and it is an excellent song. So I'm looking forward to listening to the rest. Eric, thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric.